Can hope to begin to understand this immense body of literature, the Talmud, from all the writings of the rabbis down to the centuries, is to understand the way that it's been composed. And so tonight we're going to look at the subject of the composition of the Talmud. We'll call it the Talmud since that's generally the way it's pronounced in English. And we'll at least begin to explain some of its divisions. When I say begin to explain, I don't mean I'll finish next week or we'll go on for several months. I mean, I'll just give you the outline of the divisions. I think tonight was the night I said be prepared to write a lot of these things down because there's really no way you can hope to understand this body of literature because it's so immense. It just goes on and on and on and on. Whenever you come across in your readings a reference to the Talmud, generally it'll be a threefold reference. Like we refer, it's the exact same thing that we do to our Bible. We say Genesis 1:1. Genesis is the book, 1 is the chapter, then the second one is the verse. And you kind of have to know that. You'd probably be surprised how you can tell someone in the world this is in Mark 14:8. They don't even know what you're talking about. If they've never opened a Bible, they don't know that first thing is the name of a book, then the name of a chapter, then the name of a verse. We just assume because we know that, well, that's easy. But if you're not in the club of Christianity, it might not be so easy after all to know how to even find something in the Bible. And some of you are responding like that was your problem, even though you're in the church. Like people have to look in the index to find Genesis. People that are in the church.
That's right.
Well, look at the table of contents to find the book of Genesis. And if you quote something from the book of Hezekiah, they'll go looking for it. They'll look in the table of contents and try to find that. So you're laughing at either yourself or others who do that, but you'd probably all do that if someone referred to something in the Talmud. You'd have no idea what they're talking about. So let me tell you the way it's broken down. The first thing that you'd have three numbers like... let's say, let me look for one here. You'd have 14, 9, 6. And you'd have to know what those numbers corresponded to. 14, 9, 6. Like it couldn't be, first number can't be over 63. So if you say 67, well, we know you don't know what you're talking about. First number can't be over 63. Then I said 14, that would be okay. But you couldn't, and then I think I said 9. You can't get over 10 on that one. But anyway, the first reference would be to the Tractate. Tractates, that's not a technical word from Talmudic studies. It just means a tract or a treatise or something. But they are officially called, maybe you've not ever seen the word before, but the popular divisions are popularly referred to as tractates. So the first number would correspond to a tractate. The second one to a chapter in the tractate, and the third one to a verse in that chapter. That is generally the way that you refer to something in the Talmud. Then there is another way where you can give the tractate anywhere from 1 to 63. You can give the tractate, and then you give the page number. There are standard editions of the Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, which you remember from last time, the Babylonian is the chief of the two. Palestinian is not as reliable. The Babylonian Talmud goes to about 6,000 pages. And so you try to keep that uniform in, let's say all English translations or all Spanish translations, so that if you're a Spanish Jew or Spanish Jewish scholar, you can refer to your tractate and then just refer to a page number. And we're somewhere within 6,000 or however many the editions in Spanish would have, however many pages, and it would be fairly easy to find. So the most important thing then are the tractates. That's what the cue is. That gives you your cue to finding something within the Talmud. And there are 63 of these. So don't start numbering now, but you'll have to in a moment from 1 to 63, although there'll be some divisions here and there. You don't want to just number them straight in order, but that's how far we have to go. We're going to go through all 63 tractates to tell you what they're about. Within these Tractates, you'll find anywhere from, let's see, I believe 7 to 12. You've got 7 to 12 of the tractates making up a larger order. The orders go by certain names, but those aren't nearly as important. They're just a little broader in scope than are the tractates. And then as far as chapters are concerned, well, there's no sense in giving you how they range because they go anywhere from like 3 up to 20 or something. It can be pretty broad in that division. So there are 6 orders. There are 6 orders, and you've got 7 to 12 tractates that fit under each order. Now I'm going to put up here in front for you to see these orders and the names of them. And then I'll tell you what they mean. We spell them in Hebrew. These are the 6 orders, and then, in other words, what I'm saying is, you're going to have another one here, we'll see it in a moment. You've got these orders, then let's say, what's the first order has 11 tractates. You'll have 11 tractates under this first order here. Then under the second one, you'll have about 12, I believe. 12 through 23, 12. You'll have 12 tractates under this second order. And then so many under the third, so many under the fourth, so many under the fifth, so many under the sixth. So I think I had across the top here orders of the Talmud. These orders are known as the Sedarim, S-E-D-A-R-I-M. The Sedarim, S-E-D-A-R-I-M, which just means the orders or the divisions, the Sedarim. Seder, S-E-D-E-R, is singular for each one of these orders. We'll just refer to them as orders because in English you generally call them orders. This is the Hebrew spelling, and then we'll give you the English over here. I assume everyone can spell and write in Hebrew now, but for maybe the couple of stragglers, we'll give you that for your benefit. Number 1, we have the Zeraim, the Zeraim. Number 2, the Moadei. Number 3, the Nashim. Number 4, the Nezikin. Number 5, the Kodashim. And we'll get to 6 here in a moment. 6 has to do with some holy things. This has to do with some holy things as well. 1 purifications, 1 consecrations. And here's your English spelling over here. Zeraim, Moadei, Nashim, Nezikin, Kodashim. Then I'll tell you what these words are. These words, spell something. I'll tell you what these words spell in English as soon as you get that down. We really have to start off this way. We have to keep turning this on all the time, and I'd rather get it down now. So once you get it down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then start over and put number 1, and then we'll start listing the tractates underneath that. You can just have all this as your heading up at the top of the page. And then finally down at the bottom, the Toharot. The Toharot. Zeraim, Moadei, Nashim, Nezikim, Kodashim, Toharot. The 6 orders, or the 6 Sedarim of the Talmud. And 63 tractates will fit under these, by the time we add them all up, will fit under these 6 Sedarim. So this is kind of like having to learn Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Matthew's got 28 chapters, Mark 16, Luke 21, or 24, and John 21, and then you have to fit the verses underneath that. The better you know that, obviously, the quicker you can turn through your Bible and find something. And even on occasion, it helps you spot a typographical mistake in a book or something. It might refer to a verse that's of too great of a number to fit in, let's say, Luke 19 or something. That would just be because you'd be very familiar with the chapter and know around where it ends, and if it gave you too high of a verse, you'd know it must be a typo, a typographical mistake. Okay, let's start with you can continue writing, I suppose, but let's start with the first of the orders. This is the Zeraim, which means the seeds, S-E-E-D-S, the seeds. I don't think there's any words up here you could recognize yet from what you know in Hebrew vocabulary. First ones you'll probably learn will be this. Anyone have any idea? Nashim, what that could be? I don't guess so, because it doesn't even look like a word you already know. What's man? Ish. And what's woman? Isha. And so woman plural is nashim, and man plural is anashim. So this means women. Nashim is women. And this will probably be another one that you know because it comes from a root that means holy, that will be to as an adjective before too long in studying the Hebrew language. Okay, the Zeraim, seeds. Then I'm going to give you a little statement of what this whole order is about. Seeds. And then we're going to look at a few verses in the Bible and look at a lot of other things, and this will probably be all we do. Assuming I can get through with all this material tonight, probably all we'll do for now anyway, and maybe forever on the Talmud, but you'll be surprised just knowing this will give you a much better feel for what the Talmud is all about. Okay, so the seeds, this order, Zeraim of the seeds, it relates to laws of agriculture, Palestinian crops, leaving offerings for priests and Levites, and providing gifts for the poor. Basically, that's what it has to do with, although there are a couple of concluding chapters that don't relate to some of that. Laws of agriculture, you can tell that just from seeds. It's talking about planting. Laws of agriculture, Palestinian crops, leaving offerings for priests and Levites, and providing gifts for the poor. And here in the first order, I said you'll have anywhere in these orders, anywhere from 7 to 12 tractates. Here in the first order, we'll have 11 tractates, 11 out of the 63 tractates. And remember, the tractate is the most important thing. When you're referring to it, it'll be a couple of 3 numbers, and the first of those is a tractate. And that tractate will, of course, automatically get you to the right order. Then all you have to know is the chapter and the verse there in the tractate, and you'll be on your way. Okay, so number 1. Now, I'm not going to give you the Hebrew names on all of this, or we're going to have to go through 63 Hebrew names. But obviously, there's Hebrew to all of it, so it'll be Hebrew names. But I think I will spare you of that, and we'll just give you the English. I might have a couple of Hebrew names mixed in here, it looks like. I don't remember exactly why, except on one of them I think I know why I did it. But don't question me about that. Just take it as I've got it down here. Okay, number 1, this would be the tractate. These are the tractates that we'll be looking at. Everyone have this up front now? No, not yet. Number 1 is on blessings. Hebrew word for blessing is beracha. So it'd be the berachot. But we won't give you the Hebrew names for all of this. Blessings, I'll just give you the English. Blessings. So this is how the Talmud starts out, is with a tractate on blessings. And then this tractate has 9 chapters. And I won't give you the title of the 9 chapters. Oh, by the way, the chapters will total up somewhere over 500. So that'd be another 500 names to have to give. You see, you'd go through 6 orders, then you'd go through 63 tractates, then you'd go through over 500 chapters, then you go through multiple thousands of verses. 6,000 pages in the Babylonian Talmud. So we're just trying to give you a general outline that would be good if you can have down. 9 chapters in the Tractate of Blessings, and these chapters deal with daily prayers and thanksgivings. I will give you the topic, though, of each tractate. And the topic of a single tractate will, for the most part, be the topic of the chapters that come under that. Although, let's say, more might deal, some of these 9 chapters would predominate in the dealing with prayers, and another maybe with thanksgivings. daily prayers and thanksgivings. And another thing we're going to do, at least for the first order here, is provide you some biblical parallel. Psalm 55 and verse 17. And then if you want to get real industrious, just to have something to do later on, you can do it on your own. You can find, it'd be interesting to do. You test your knowledge of the Old Testament. Take each one of these tractates here that has so many chapters that deals with a certain topic, and then find some parallel in the Old Testament. They took a verse or a passage or something and then elaborated, greatly, vastly elaborated that into all types of different laws and details. And you could find some corresponding or parallel Old Testament passage. Psalm 55:17 speaks of the prayer 3 times a day. Do we all have this now? Okay. Second tractate. And we've looked at that verse a lot in ethics. That's why we're not looking that one up. We'll look up some of the others. Second tractates on the corners of the field. These have elaborate Hebrew names for them, but we'll just give them to you in English. On the corners of the field. And what do you think that has to do with? No. The corners of the field. No. Those would be in the same category. We'll get to those later. 4 corners. What about that? No. Look what we're under. I said it relates to laws of agriculture, Palestinian crops, leaving offerings for Levites, and for gifts to the poor, for the poor, yes. Leviticus 19 and verse 9. You know how that's said many times, don't glean the corners of your field. Leviticus 19 and verse 9. We will turn and look up some of these, and we won't do this for all of these 63 tractates, though. But it looks like you need to look up, we're only on the second one, and you didn't even know what that was all about. Leviticus 19:9. Because I want you to see something from this. We won't even get beyond this second one, and it'll open your eyes up to the essence of the Talmud, what it is all about. Second tractate on the corners of the field, 8 chapters on gleanings that are to be left for the poor. Leviticus 19:9, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. You can't wholly reap the corners of your field. Now you say, well, what's so interesting about that? Well, here's what's interesting. They wrote 8 chapters on what Moses meant here in one verse. That's why I said the Talmud, it just is explosive when it comes to the most fanciful, ridiculous notions a person could think of. And this is what Jesus is dealing with so often in the Gospels over there. What else can you say except don't glean too closely the corners of your fields? But you see, these people get so legalistically minded that they're going to take for themselves as much as possible. They're not going to leave much for the poor. And so you have to lay it down. In other words, a lot of people look at the Old Testament that is extreme bondage and legalism because it tells you everything to do and not to do. No, it doesn't either. It says don't leave the corners. But how far out into the field would you count as a corner? You see, if you're a good Jew who loves the Lord and wants to do His Word, you're going to be liberal. You're going to leave whatever you think and maybe a little extra. And that's what God intends for them to do. This is very interesting here. This is Old Testament. But God expects them to practice liberty, to practice love here. He didn't specify the meters or the feet or the cubits involved here of how far out. Or what if you don't have a corner? What if you just have a rounded curve to your field? Couldn't you plow a field so that you have all curves, and therefore you don't have to leave anything for the poor then? You better believe the Jews would do this. Instead of having a field like we think of a square, then make their fields in a circular shape. And if it's around in a circle, you've got no corners. Therefore, you get everything then, nothing for the poor. So the rabbis said, now we got to make some laws here. And they would specify how far away and what angle, is it going to be 45-degree angle, or what angle you can have in the field, and how far out, and how far away from the corner. I mean, if you've got a right angle there, and you come out so far, you're going to end up with a triangle. I trust you see that in your mind. But how far out are you going to pull that, though? See, the law of Moses doesn't say. Now, that's interesting. This is what the Talmud is all about. This is what I said last week. This is basically about all you need to know. We could stop tonight, and you'd understand what the Talmud is about. You really could. You could stop right here. But like we said last week, situations came up later in Israel where they felt these aren't dealt with in the law of Moses. And therefore, some poor man could bring his case before the rabbis. It's someone, they had a round field and it wasn't a square one. And so they had to make a case decision there, and that's passed down, and that's codified starting AD 200 into the Mishnah, the most important part of the Talmud. And the Jews were just like that. But it's interesting that people think that the Old Testament is just law, and there's a lot of liberty there. It leaves it up to you and to your own thoughtful generosity to provide for the poor. But because many people didn't or wouldn't or found ways out of it, then all these case decisions came up and were made, and they were incorporated from the oral traditions into the written form, the codified form of the Talmud. Because I don't know what you'd do with a verse like Leviticus 19 and verse 9, except if you were a regenerate Jew, you just wouldn't glean the corners, but I don't know how far away from the corner, though. It just would be up to you in your heart how much you wanted to leave for the poor. And if you'll turn over to the book of Ruth, this is where, I guess, the most famous place where it's practiced here. The book of Ruth, chapter 2 and verse 9. Now, it doesn't just have to do with the corners, remember. It had to do with your olive trees. Don't double glean the olive trees. Once you hit one limb with a stick, take whatever comes off and leave the rest of it on for the poor people. That's the way you'd get olives out of a tree. You'd go through and hit the limbs with sticks. But what if you hit too early and they weren't ripe yet and they're going to still hang onto the tree? Then after you've struck the tree once, now they're all stuck for the poor whenever they're going to ripen. So you'd have to figure ways out of that. That if you happen to hit it before they were ripe, then not very many are going to fall. Then you're going to lose your whole crop then. So somehow you've got to get a law that you can work your way out of that so you can get it a double hit if you hit it before the right time. Well, and another thing, not just the corners, but your whole field. Go over it once and leave the rest of it there. Nothing's going to get everything. And even good farmers today know, leave something out there for the animals to come and get. The dove down south, they thrive on don't go over that cornfield twice. Leave a lot of the stuff out there. That's where you're going to have a good dove shoot it, as well as just leave something for the dove to survive on. It's just the kind, considerate, humanitarian thing to do. Ruth 2 in verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And so she goes out and she happens to light on part of the field belonging to Boaz, verse 3, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And he says to her in verse 8, hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field. See, that sometimes was the only way the poor had a means of obtaining their sustenance. So it was very important that this law be established and be practiced in Israel. Neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. And so, verse 10, she bows down and she's very grateful. And he even, of course, tells the reapers, leave a little extra. Not only what you would just accidentally leave, but leave a little extra on purpose for this Moabitess woman because she had found favor in his sight. So much for the second tractate. But can you believe it? 8 chapters written on gleanings to be left for the poor. But you get it all down just in the right order. The third tractate's entitled Doubtful. English name, Doubtful. 7 chapters on which fruits must have tithes paid off of them. Which fruits must have tithes paid off of them. Leviticus 27 and verse 30. Because the law doesn't specify. The law doesn't specify if it's, a first crop or a second crop, or you find it growing wild in your field, or it's too small to be able to count, or whatever. Just about the last verse in the book of Leviticus, 27:30. All the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. But how large up may we go on fruit, and how small down may we go on the seed? Well, that's doubtful. That's why we have this name for the third tractate. It's a little doubtful. So they write 7 chapters on the fruits that must have tithes paid off of them. Number 4, mixtures. 9 chapters on which fruit and grain crops may not be mingled in the same field. This is, you see, this becomes the basis for Judaism. Whenever we use Judaism like I just did, in a technical sense, we don't mean the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. We mean this hyper-legalized form of the Jewish faith. And therefore it's in a derisive sense that we refer to it as Judaism. Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 9. You see, we could do this with every tractate, but you can test yourself after we go through the first 11 or so of these and find them on your own. Deuteronomy 22 and verse 9, thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with divers seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. So mixtures deals with which ones can and which ones can't, which ones are proper and how close, and can the fields be beside each other, does there have to be a fallow strip in between, or, you know, just a whole arrangement and mixture and organizing all of this. The 5th tractate is the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year. 10 chapters written on Leviticus 25:2. Or on this principle involved, Leviticus 25:2. Speaking to the children of Israel and saying to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You'll neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. You see, they had a Sabbath, a weekly Sabbath, then they had a yearly Sabbath, and then they had the great Sabbath that was known as Jubilee. That was much more involved. That was every 50 years. Number 6, the Tractate on Oblations. 11 chapters on the subject of things like the heave offering. Leviticus 7:14. Do you know much about the wave offering and the heave offering? Well, if you know much about it, it's because you had to read something besides the Bible, because there's not much in the Old Testament on the breast and the shoulder of the heave offering and the wave offering. They're found over in Leviticus chapter 7. What little teaching we have, most of it's found right here. Leviticus 7 and verse 14. But what is a heave offering? What does that even mean, a heave offering? Or a wave offering, that you heave the shoulder and wave the breast before the Lord. What does that mean? Well, we're not told here, you see. So, because the law of Moses doesn't speak to that matter, then someone had to write on that later on. Verse 14, of it ye shall offer one out of the whole oblation for a heave offering. We're talking about the 6th tractate on oblations. Out of the whole oblation, one will be a heave offering unto the Lord, and it shall be the priest that sprinkleth the blood of the peace offerings. Then look in verse 30. His hand shall bring the offerings of the Lord made by fire, and the fat with the breast. It shall he bring, that the breast may be waved for a wave offering before the Lord. And then verse 34 sums it all up, for the wave breast and the heave shoulder. So if you know much about that, it's because you're reading something besides the Bible. Because that's not, in other words, that's not bad if you fail the test right then when I said, do you know much about them? You say no. Well, that only stands to reason, because the Bible doesn't know much about them. The wave breast, the heave shoulder have I taken of the children of Israel from off the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them unto Aaron the priest, and unto his sons by a statute forever from among the children of Israel. So a lot has to be written. As a matter of fact, 11 chapters the wave breast and the heave offering. Then we have in the 7th place tithes. Tithes, 5 chapters written on what is due the Levites. And for both this one and the next tractate, we'll need to look in Numbers chapter 18. Notice how, well, I could say probably all of it in some form or another can be found here in the Law of Moses. Although we began with blessings, the Berachot, by looking over into Psalm 55:17, we could have gone back to passages like Deuteronomy chapter 6 and seen some germ forms of that. Numbers 18 and verse 24. But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, now we're back to that, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. We could look at other verses. I'm just giving you a few of these. So 5 chapters on what is due from the general population in Israel, the Levites. Then the 8th tractate deals with the so-called second tithe. Although there's always a question about the proper names for these things, I'll just stay with the way it should be translated. The second tithe, 5 more chapters then on what the Levites had to pay to the priests. Now we all know, do we not, that the Levites and the priests are 2 different groups of people. The Levites were a more general group. The priests were taken from among the Levites. There were more Levites than there were priests. And the general population would tithe to the Levites, and then the Levites would tithe to the priests. And the general population would tithe to the Levites, and then the Levites would tithe to the priests. And same chapter, chapter 18, verses 25 and 26. And by the way, I think I've shared this with you before, that is where the church got its notion that once the people tithe into the church, and the church has to give 1/10 of its income to some other church or some other group or someone somewhere else, because they're back to the Old Testament pattern of the Levites and the priests. You find it in the Old Testament, but you don't find it in the New. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Thus speak unto the Levites. Now he just said the people had to give a tithe to the Levites. Now he says, speak to the Levites, and say unto them, when you take of the children of Israel the tithes which I've given you from them for your inheritance, then you'll give 1/10 of that, offer it up to the Lord, 1/10 part of the tithe of the tithe. And that, of course, would be given to the priests. It's not just given to the Lord because the Lord doesn't need anything, nor does he eat anything. But the Levites had to be sustained, and the priests as well. The 9th tractate deals with dough. Not money, but real dough. 4 chapters on the cakes that the women had to bring to the priests. Now this is a little more obscure in the Pentateuch, but turn over to Jeremiah and we see a perversion of this. Jeremiah speaks about it on a couple of occasions, I believe. I've got one marked down in his book, the 7th chapter and the 18th verse, where there's a perversion of this. The women are making their cakes, but they're not offering them to the priest and through them to the Lord. Jeremiah 7:18. The children gather wood. This is a family affair. The children gather the wood, the fathers start the fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke the Lord to anger. But notice who's doing the baking of the cakes and the kneading of the dough. It's the women. So that was their responsibility, to knead the cakes to bring to the priests to offer to the Lord. The 10th tractate is entitled Foreskin, F-O-R-E, foreskin. And it's not about what you might think just from the word. It's a metaphorical use of the term foreskin. No, it doesn't have anything to do with circumcision, but rather 3 chapters on forbidden trees in Israel during their first 3 years of growth. 3 chapters on the forbidden trees of Israel. You know all this is in the Old Testament? Leviticus 19:23 through 25. But you see, there's hardly a more complicated portion of the Bible than the Law of Moses. Not Genesis. You have to get all the way up into, starting with Exodus 20, right on through Deuteronomy 34, and you're dealing with some of the most difficult passages of the Bible. Leviticus 19:23, when you shall come into the land, and it interests me, though, all of these laws, because unlike the rabbis and their notion of this, God had spiritual things, and he was teaching the people behind all of these various carnal ordinances that were given to them. There were spiritual meanings behind all of this. And when you ascertain that, then you are really blessed, because you see how blessed the law of Moses was. In its intent, maybe not in its outward form, but in its intent, it certainly was. When ye shall come into the land and shall have planted all manner of trees for food, then you'll count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised. And that's where they get the name foreskin for this chapter. You'll count it uncircumcised. 3 years shall it be as uncircumcised unto you, and it will not be eaten. But in the 4th year all the fruit thereof will be holy, to praise the Lord withal. And in the 5th year you can eat of the fruit thereof, that it may yield unto you the increase thereof. I am the Lord your God. So they had quite a period of trial there with their forbidden trees. But which ones were forbidden, and what if you got a certain amount of fruit, or what if the tree didn't bear to 7 years, then since you didn't get any off that tree for 7 years, couldn't you steal some off another tree a little bit early before the 3 or the 4 year period? So more reasoning involved. But it's not dealt with in the law of Moses. That's what's interesting. What if you have a tree that doesn't bear for 7 or 8 or 9 years? Then shouldn't you get some more off the other trees whenever they're in their 2nd year of bearing or whatever? Well, the rabbis had to decide about that. And Jesus comes along saying all that's really nonsense, fighting over all that stuff. It's really nonsense. And you end up with 2 groups of people there. You end up with those that love the Lord and would rather go extra to make sure they're obeying God. And then you've got others who are going to find some sneaky way out because they're covetous and because they're greedy, and they want to get more for themselves. Wow. The final tractate in the Zeraim section is entitled First Fruits. First Fruits, 4 chapters on the first fruits, like Leviticus 23:10. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheave of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. We used to sing a song, bringing in the sheaves, and I never knew what that was. I didn't know what a sheaf was. I thought they were saying sheep all the time, bringing the sheep into the kingdom. We were singing, bring in the sheaves. That's the Old Testament law there. Bring in your first fruits. That's what it was. It was a tithe song. It's what it was. Bring in your sheaves to the Lord. I thought, what is a sheaf? I just thought it was a sheep, that we're trying to bring in sheep. But that didn't make any sense to me. Sing all those. See, we're back to denominational songs. Some of them are ridiculous. Some of them are good, and some of them are just ridiculous. Let's get into the second order. The second order, the Moaday. The Moaday, what does that mean? Generally in King James, I think it's translated feasts. But I think probably a better translation would be festival. Feast means you're eating all the time. But a festival means there's more going on besides just eating. Feast is maybe a little bit too limited of a term. So maybe some of your other translations will give you festivals. The Moaday, the festivals, would be regulations for the sacred seasons. They can also be referred to as that, the sacred seasons. And here we'll have 12 tractates on the sacred seasons and various regulations imposed. Okay, then we're on number 12. This will be the first one under this order, but we'll keep them in order of 1 to 63. Number 12 would be the Tractate of the Sabbath, the Sabbath. Here we've got 24 chapters. What was one of Jesus' biggest problems in the Gospels? It was the Sabbath day, wasn't it? It was the Sabbath day. You see, the more you know about this, the more you know about your whole Bible then, even something as boring as this. You'll find this has just about more chapters, I think, than any of them. Is this one on the Sabbath. That was one of the biggest things in Judaism, was the proper worship of the Lord on the Sabbath day. Certain things you could do, certain things you couldn't do. And one thing you couldn't do was get healed on that day. Just stay sick until the next day, and then it'd be all right to get healed. But don't get healed on the Sabbath day. 24 chapters on laws for the Sabbath day. Number 13 is entitled Mingling. Mingling. 10 chapters on ceremonies by which the Sabbath boundary was extended. 10 chapters on that topic. 10 chapters on ceremonies by which the Sabbath boundary was extended. We mentioned this verse in a recent message, but we didn't look it up then. If you'll turn over to Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. Let's get the context and start with verse 9. Mingling, 10 chapters on ceremonies by which the Sabbath boundary was extended. You see, the religious leaders get criticized for their narrow interpretation of the law. They're very, very fastidious, very meticulous in their interpretation. But at the same time, they always left a back door of escape in case they were too fastidious or meticulous for their own purpose. They'd have another law that says you can get out of that strict one if you do something else instead of that or in addition to that. When he had spoken these things, while they beheld, Jesus was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. While they looked steadfastly toward heaven, then they had these two angels appear that report verse 11. And so, according to the end of Luke's gospel, they return with great joy. Then returned they unto Jerusalem, from the mount called Olivet. Mount of Olives is a mountain just east of Jerusalem. Overlooks the city, looks right over the city walls even to this day, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey, which was about, 2,000 cubits, which was about a half a mile. About a half a mile, a little bit over a half a mile, I suppose, was as far as you could walk on the Sabbath day. That's interesting that Jesus chose not to, let's say, descend from Mount Carmel. They'd have to break the Sabbath law to get from Mount Carmel all the way down to Jerusalem. But he goes just about the right distance for them to walk a Sabbath day's journey from the Mount of Olives back to the city of Jerusalem. Then number 14 is the Passover. 10 chapters on Passover celebration. How many of you have come across this in your thinking or reading before? You'll come across if you read enough. Remember back in the Exodus account of the Passover that whenever you were offering the Passover lamb on Passover night, you were to stand with your sandals on your feet. Everyone was to stand, your staff in your hands, your garb wrapped around you, ready to go. That was true for the first Passover in Israel. But what about future Passovers, though? Did Israel have to practice that? We don't find them practicing that later on. Was that not some symbolism involved in their exit from Egypt that night or the next morning? Was that not the reason why they had to have their feet shod and the staff in their hand and their clothes wrapped about them ready to go and all standing instead of sitting? Interesting question. It's not dealt with in the Old Testament, whether that is something binding on the Jews throughout all the Old Testament economy. What about when you get over into the wilderness wandering? And they don't observe Passover. They skip it many times over in the wilderness wandering. Was that allowed? Was that wrong for them to do? So 10 chapters on Passover celebration that would help to solve some of these questions. Number 15 deals with shekels. 8 chapters on the half shekel that was to be paid for public worship. Remember, there's a verse back in the law that speaks of a half shekel that every male, in other words, had to pay for the upkeep of the temple. Not so much payment of a tithe to priests and Levites, but just for the physical repairs necessary in the temple building or the tabernacle precincts, whatever was appropriate or pertinent for that period of time. And so if you're wanting to test yourself on all this, whenever we get through and you've got extra time, you can find references in the Old Testament to parallel this. You'd have to find that verse in the law that speaks of the half shekel. Number 16 is the Day of Atonement. 18 chapters on Day of Atonement. Or 8 chapters, excuse me. 8 chapters on Day of Atonement. Number 17. They've already dealt with some of these days before. Here we come to Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles. 5 chapters on this. Number 18, the 18th tractate, entitled The Good Day. The Good Day. 5 chapters on miscellaneous laws for holy days. That's what a good day was, a holy day. 5 chapters on miscellaneous laws for the holy days, such as probably one of the most famous arguments that the rabbis engaged in: could you eat an egg that had been laid by a chicken on the Sabbath day? Did that chicken not work to lay that egg? Therefore, if you ate that egg, then you're sinning against the Lord's holy day. That's a day of rest. Tell your bird, just hold it in you till tomorrow. Let them build up in there and let them come out tomorrow. What would you do about something? If you were a Jew that thought, now, any type of work on the Sabbath, what would you tell your chicken then? You'd have to tell him something. You'd want the bird not to lay an egg on that day and profane your hen house out back or something. You'd want that bird to hold the egg in. And if the bird let the egg out, then could you eat that egg? A lot of arguments over that. You say, well, what was decided? Well, it never was decided, because people held to both opinions right on down through history, whether you could eat the egg or you couldn't eat the egg. And you see, this is what Judaism today is based on, not the Old Testament, but on the Talmud, on all these fanciful, ridiculous ideas. And that's probably why people have one of the most important misconceptions one could have about the New Testament, that Jesus is criticizing the Mosaic Law, and he's not. He's never criticizing the Mosaic Law. The only thing he criticizes is the Talmud. It's not in written form at that time, but in all of the oral traditions that have been passed down, they have these ridiculous notions. Number 19 deals with New Year. They had a New Year celebration. 4 chapters that dealt with the New Year celebration. They had 2 years, remember, in Israel, a civil one, a civil ceremonial one, and just a secular one. They had 2 different calendars in Israel. Fasting would be number 20. 4 chapters that dealt with fasting. Now, what was the doctrine of fasting according to the law of Moses? Anyone know? Once a year? Right. When was that? Day of Atonement. But it's just kind of been practiced in various religions down through the course of humankind, that if you go without food, somehow that makes you more holy than other people. That's the old ascetic spirit, asceticism. If you go without food, it's going to make you better. So although the law only prescribed one day annually for fasting on the Day of Atonement, we see after Babylonian captivity they had 4 yearly fasts, and a lot of other people would like to come up with more than that. You'll look over in a passage we've also looked at recently, Luke chapter 18 and verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this publican. I fast twice a week. 104 times a year. This man fasted. The Old Testament law said once on the Day of Atonement. But you could fast more often and get yourself more holy. So, chapter on fastings. And they had it established for the most holy people to fast twice a week. And he's right in line. You can read this right in the Talmud, right in this tractate that we're talking about. This Pharisee is based upon that. Not in the written form in the Pharisees' day, but it was in the oral form then. Then number 21, the roll. Not a Danish sweet roll, but 4 chapters on the public reading of the book of Esther. The book of Esther had become very important for the Jews. They had a feast known as Purim that was based upon the book of Esther, or some of the events anyway of the lots being cast in the book of Esther. So it was an important book for them. Number 22, a small holy day. a small holy day. 3 chapters on the half holidays during Passover and Tabernacles. Remember how Passover coincided with the Feast of Unleavened Bread? But Passover was the holy day, and the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were just partially as good as Passover. And you have something similar with Tabernacles as well. 3 chapters on the half holidays during Passover and Tabernacles. But most of the time you'll find the term Passover is not used in a technical sense even in the Bible. It doesn't mean just one day, the Passover day. It means the Passover day and the corresponding Feast of the Unleavened Bread that would last for a period of 1 week. And number 23, this will be the 12th and the final tractate under the festivals, the Mo'adeh. And this would be on feasting, You'll be very interested whenever we teach Old Testament theology and learn all of these ins and outs of the law. It's very intricate, but it's been one of the most enjoyable things I think I've ever studied. Has had to do with the intricacies of the law of Moses and what those things mean. Why was the woman unclean for a shorter period of time after she bore a son than after she bore a daughter? One was 33 days, one was 66 days, exactly double. Why? There must be a reason why. A woman was ceremonially impure, unclean, for a longer period of time after bearing a girl into the world, as opposed to a boy. There's a reason behind that, and the reasons are very, very interesting. Feasting, 3 chapters on voluntary sacrifices offered by the Jews during the great feasts. Not all sacrifice was prescribed, that is, that you had to make it on a certain day or certain days, but there were voluntary ones. Like the peace offering was a voluntary offering. A voluntary sacrifice. And they didn't in those days have to so much give money because their livelihood didn't consist in a bank account but in their flocks and their herds. And to give something from one of your flocks or your herds was to give a lot. Of course, they still had to give a half shekel if it was a male for the upkeep of the maintenance of the temple. But giving half shekel was not nearly as important as giving an offering from one's flocks or one's herds. Then we come to the third order of the women, the Nashim, the women. Laws on women, marriage, divorce, remarriage, things of this nature. And it's a small order, 7 tractates on Nashim. Number 24, first one under this. In Hebrew is known as the Yibum. Deals with one's brother and his obligation to marry a childless widow. 16 chapters on that. 16 chapters on the obligation of your brother to marry your childless widow. By widow, we mean that you're now dead, and so it's your brother's responsibility to marry her. That, again, is what the book of Ruth is about over in the final chapter in chapter 4, sometimes referred to as the levirate law of marriage. It comes from a Latin term that means your brother, or your brother-in-law. It would be her brother-in-law, the widow's brother-in-law. Deuteronomy 25 and verse 7. It would be based on this verse, however. Deuteronomy 25 and verse 7. 16 chapters on the levirate law of marriage. Number 25 deals with contracts. 13 chapters on marriage contracts. That's a big thing, marriage. What if you get stuck with the wrong partner? So the contract was very important. How much you had to give in light of how much you got in return. Number 26, vows. 11 chapters on vows. Remember the vow teaching in the Old Testament that if a father hears his unmarried daughter make a vow, if he doesn't agree with it, he can annul it. But if she's married, then it has to be her husband and all of this. A lot of important things about vows. 11 chapters on vows. Number 27, Nazaritism. The Hebrew Nazarite is under consideration here 9 chapters on vows of abstinence. 9 chapters on vows of abstinence. Who are some Nazarites in the Bible? John the Baptist. Where does it say he was? It doesn't say that he was, does it? You have to know some other things about laws of abstinence. It doesn't call him a Nazarite. Who else was a Nazarite? Samson. It calls Samson a Nazarite. So it pays to know something about what the laws were. We're not talking now so much about the Talmud, but about the Bible, to know whether someone was Nazarite or not. What about that case that Paul got into trouble with? Those young men that had taken a vow upon themselves. We're not told what type of vow, but maybe it was some temporary form of Nazaritism. We've got most of the examples in the Bible, I guess all of them are. They're lifelong Nazarites. Samson, John the Baptist were lifelong. But Numbers chapter 6 doesn't teach lifelong Nazaritism, though. It only teaches for a temporary purpose, for a temporary reason, that one would engage in a vow of abstinence. So whenever you see someone who's lifelong in the vow of a Nazarite, like Samson, we've got something unusual on our hands. But remember, they couldn't even eat grapes or raisins, not even raisins. And so you're going to have some chapters definitely dealing with that based on number 6. Then 28. Oh, and by the way, if you wonder why that's under women, well, could women vow to abstain for something? What about Anna over in the New Testament? She was serving the Lord in the temple night and day with prayers and fastings. Don't we read that of her? Could not women also, although it doesn't talk about women in number 6, it only talks about men. So you see, these are the questions that have to be answered. Could a woman, could she not also separate, make a vow to abstain from something like food or some type of pleasure, and separate herself to be holy unto the Lord for a certain period of time? Since the law of Moses doesn't deal with that, then the rabbis felt that they had to. Number 28, erring women. 9 chapters on this. Women who are going astray, making mistakes or whatever. Erring women. 9 chapters on this. What about over in Proverbs? Talks many times about a bad wife or a bad woman. What do you do to one who's bad? Number 29, divorce bills. 9 chapters on the document that was given in divorce. We might as well turn over to this familiar passage, Deuteronomy chapter 24. It is just so brief here. Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. This is just about all the law of Moses has to say on divorce. Deuteronomy 24, beginning with verse 1. Looks like we're going to go a little while tonight. If we go over an hour, probably this will be the only teaching that we have then. I didn't know it was going to take us this long. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, and we'll deal with these passages more in ethics, but she finds no favor in his eyes. Well, what would you count as not having found favor? Because he hath found some uncleanness in her. Well, what's uncleanness mean? Does that just have to do with something sexually? That she's not a virgin? Or does it deal with something else? Or does it deal with something else plus that? Then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. She was allowed to remarry. And if the latter husband hate her and write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and sendeth her out, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife, after that she is defiled. Well, what does that mean? For that is abomination before the Lord. Thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. And I think we do know enough about passages like Matthew 19 to know that the question of divorce and remarriage was an important one in the 1st century A.D. as far as the Jews were concerned. Were you allowed to divorce and remarry? Under what circumstances? What cases were allowed? To ever really understand the teaching of the New Testament on that, you have to know something of the rabbinic background to all of that. Because you won't just get it back in the Old Testament. And then number 30, this would be number 7, and the final one under the Nashim, the women, deals with betrothals. 4 chapters on betrothals. Now I want to show you an interesting passage about this. Maybe you've never seen before, I don't know. If you'll turn over to Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, the case of Jesus' parents. Matthew 1, verses 18 through 20. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph. Espoused, that means betrothed. We use the words synonymously, espoused, betrothed. To Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband. Now I thought she was just engaged to be married. Now Joseph is referred to as her husband. So this is something different, you see, in Jewish practice than what we have in American practice today. Being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. But while he thought on these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary, who's already your wife, thy wife. But we just read about being betrothed or espoused or engaged back in the 18th verse. For that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. But I mean, today in American society, if you're engaged to someone, an angel could hardly appear to you and say, don't be afraid to take this woman who is your wife. It doesn't say take her as your wife, take her who already is your wife. But yet she's not your wife because you haven't been married yet. So, back to the Talmud and betrothals to understand something about that. Then the 4th order, the nezikin. What does that deal with? With damages. It deals with civil and criminal laws in Israel, which get very complicated, which weren't dealt with, the rabbis felt, in a complete enough fashion in the Old Testament law. And here we have 10 tractates. They're the nezikin, damages. Number 31, or the first of the tractates under damages, number 31 is entitled The First Gate. The First Gate.
This message will be continued on the following tape.